Our next speaker, Michael J. Coles, is an Atlanta business executive, serial entrepreneur, education advocate, well-known public speaker, and the namesake of the Coles College of Business at Kennesaw State University. Michael.
Everybody hear me?
Yes. Well, first of all, I know every time somebody gets up to speak, they always say how excited they are to be here. But I really am excited to be here because I have had a long-standing relationship
With TiE Atlanta. They started in 1998. In 1998, I'm just going to tell you this just kind of briefly. I stepped out of the arena of business and I ran for the United States Senate against Paul Coverdale. And for whatever reason, the Indian community in Atlanta embraced that run. And I was very excited and developed this close relationship because they held many events for me to get to meet a number of people within the Atlanta community and around the state. And it was mostly because I was on the rubber chicken circuit. And the Indian food was incredible. So anytime someone would say to me, well, we can go to this Indian event, but they're only going to have 30 people, or we can go to this other event, which has like 200 people, I would say, let's go to the Indian event. Because I always knew that the food was going to be much, much better. Which probably would tell you why I lost that race. So anyway, so my wife Donna is here with me today, and if you all have a chance to read my book, we will have books outside. You will find out that why I always refer to Donna as my better 80%. The book really reveals so much how she has supported me throughout my career. So I've had 4 successful exits. I was sold the Great American Cookie Company in '98. I started a bank, a charter bank with a group of local people in Marietta, Georgia. We grew the bank to about $350 million and we sold it to Synovus. After I lost my race against Paul Coverdale, I kind of knocked around for a while. And then eventually bought into a company called Caribou Coffee, where you have already heard I grew the company, doubled the size of it, took it public, and then eventually we sold it. And then most recently, I was chairman of the board of Brand Bank Holding Company and Brand Bank, and we just exited that company in September of this past year. And at the same time, I will tell you that we sold the bank and I lost my job as chairman because the new bank had their own team of people. My wife and I were also building a house, and at the same time we sold our condo. We had nowhere to live, so I was both homeless and jobless. And I thought about getting a cardboard sign, and stand somewhere and need help, but I wound up not doing it. So let me just take you back a little bit. I want to tell you, first of all, why I wrote this book. I've been writing this book for 25 years. And when you understand my story, you'll probably understand why about 25 or 30 years ago I started being asked to come to different groups and tell my story. I started collecting little scraps of paper over the years. I would write little notes about things that had happened or things that I thought would be important in the book on literally napkins, hotel stationery, and then of course when the smartphone came out, I started going into Notepad and I started writing down all these things that I thought would be so important in this book when I got around to writing it. And then one day I wrote a note of something that had happened. I thought it was important. And then I wrote a note to myself, which read, so why is it you keep taking all these notes? Because at this point the folder was about that thick. Why do you keep taking all these notes and yet you haven't gotten around to writing this book? Now you know you're in trouble when you start talking to yourself, because I wrote that question down and I actually answered it. I said, well, the reason I haven't done it is I know something else really important is going to happen and I'm going to want to include it in the book. Well, I then answered the next part of that, which was to say one of 2 things was going to happen. Either I wasn't going to remember it or I was going to be dead. And so I decided that day that I would begin to formulate how to write this book. Fortunately, my wife and I endowed the business school up at Kennesaw State University, and I called the dean of the school and said, I finally am going to write this book. because the school for a long time had been asking me to write it. And they said, well, you know Catherine Lewis. And I said, yeah, very well. She said, you should call Catherine, that she's written 13 books. She's co-authored 9 and written 4 of her own. And you ought to call her and see if she'll help you write it. And she did. And I always give a shout out to Catherine, because without her, the book never would have happened. And the reason I realized I had waited 25 years to write the book was because Catherine Lewis found my voice and helped me write the book. So that's my shout out to Catherine. So I wrote this book not to boast about my career or my success, however moderate it may have been. I wrote this book really to try to motivate other people to think about the fact that they can do more than they think they can. You know, my life, I think, and the businesses I've been involved in are very relatable. I mean, I've talked to kindergarten classes and told my story, because I think for a lot of young people, as well as MBA students, doctorate classes that I've had the opportunity to talk to Fortune 500 companies, the cookie business is pretty simple in most people's minds. Although it's complicated, for little kids, it's kind of like a lemonade stand. How do you take a lemonade stand, build it all the way across the country? And so I feel like my success is not like Steve Jobs or some of these other big careers and people who've written books, and people who read those books, there's no doubt they get motivated from them, but do they close the book and say, I could never do that? I wanted to write a book where the last words in my book are, I know you can do this because I did. So let me just start a little bit and tell you about the cookie business. So my partner and I, we started the cookie company with $4,000 each. We invested $8,000. We borrowed $25,000 from a bank. They made us sign a personal guarantee for the $25,000. We had to put up every personal asset we owned to get the $25,000. When I say every personal asset, our cars, our house, our clothes, everything. And the reason was they had absolutely no faith that the cookie business could possibly succeed. It was a very tough time to go into the cookie business. There were already 3 major companies. One had almost 100 stores, 2 had almost 50 stores. And we, again, had no experience in the food business. We virtually had no money, and shopping mall developers had no way to want to have a cookie store in their mall. It's hard to believe this today, but back then there were no single concept food ideas in any mall in the United States. Now today you got cinnamon rolls and you've got all kinds of other single concepts, but nothing existed. And so we were selling cookies at the time at 30 cents. And you know, the average mall was going to be, rent was going to be anywhere between $20,000 and $30,000 a year. You got to think about how many cookies you got to sell to pay the rent. And so my partner and I had been trying to get a location. Nobody in Atlanta. We wanted to open our first store in Atlanta. No one in Atlanta would even talk to us, including the worst mall in Atlanta at the time, a mall called Perimeter Mall. Now, if you go to Atlanta today, Perimeter Mall is probably one of the best malls in Atlanta. But back then, an average mall was doing about $100 a square foot, and Perimeter was down below $70 a square foot. It had been a very successful mall, but several years after it opened, a very big mall called Cumberland Mall opened just a few exits away on the interstate, and it killed Perimeter Mall. But Perimeter Mall, owned by the Rouse Company, brought in this hotshot guy, a guy named Jeff Weil, and he was coming in to revitalize the mall. And so we found out that a space was coming available, one door off Center Court. We called Jeff. He wouldn't take our call. He wouldn't make an appointment. And we were desperate at this point. We had bought all our equipment. I mean, we were ready to go. And so we decided we're going to figure out a way to get to Jeff. We did a little reconnaissance. We went to the mall one morning, like 8 o'clock, and just waited for Jeff to pull up. We saw what kind of his itinerary was. Probably get arrested today for doing this. Matter of fact, I'm sure we'd get arrested. Anyway, and we kind of figured out our game plan. We left and we came back the next day. 8 o'clock in the morning, we walk into the mall office, maybe 8:15. Jeff was already there, and we walk up to the receptionist and we tell her, we're here to see Jeff Weil. And she says, you have an appointment? And we said, no, but we only need 5 minutes of his time. She said, well, he has a very, very busy day today. I doubt that he'll be able to see you. And we said, no, it's just 5 minutes. We just need 5 minutes. We just want to talk to him about an idea we have. And she said, honestly, I don't think I'll be able to see it. It's all right, we'll wait. So we sat down and on a couch waiting for Jeff to find the 5 minutes. And about maybe 30, 40 minutes after we were there, we hear the receptionist. Now we can only hear one side of the conversation. Yes, they're still here. No, I don't think they're going to leave. And so just about 9 o'clock, Jeff comes out of his office. Now here's what we found out the day before. Now remember, this is 1977. This is way before Starbucks, way before Caribou Coffee. The day before, we watched Jeff walk into his office carrying a thermos of coffee. And we knew at some point he was going to have to go to the bathroom. And the bathroom was on the other side of the hallway where the offices were. And sure enough, Jeff comes out, he sees us there, he's very angry. And he said, what do you guys want? We said, look, we've got a great concept for the cookie business we want to tell you about. He said, all right, I'll give you 5 minutes after I get back. He said, go in my office. So we went in his office and we sat down and we gave him this great pitch about the cookie business. We had been doing research on it for about 7 or 8 months. We told him why the concept was different, why he should take a risk with us. And finally, at the end of it, he shook his head and he said, you know what, guys? I'm going to do you guys the biggest favor of your life. And we got really excited. He said, I'm not going to lease you that space. And we were like, what do you mean, Jeff? Why won't you lease us the space? And he said, look, you look like nice guys. You probably have nice families. But if you release that space, he said, we're going to have to sign a 10-year lease. You're going to have to personally guarantee it. This mall is owned by the Rouse Company. It's a $250,000 obligation. You'll never sell enough cookies to pay the rent. And I just don't want to be responsible for you losing your families, your homes, everything else. In the back of my mind, I'm thinking, that's all right. CNS Bankers are already going to get it anyway if we fail, so it doesn't really matter. And we begged him again. We threw out the business plan, and he turned to us and he said, all right, here's the lease. It was about that thick. Take it to a good lawyer, and I'm sure you guys are going to come back in here next week, and you'll say, you know what, Jeff, thanks, but no thanks. But we threw out, this big telephone number of how much business we would do, and tell him what a great decision he was making, and we left, and that was on towards the early part of June. And on June 10th, we started building the store. 19 days later, we had the store ready to go. We were very excited. We had no money for marketing. We went around the surrounding neighborhoods around Perimeter Mall. We went to all the mall employees, and we handed out flyers saying when we would open. And the hook was that from 9 o'clock in the morning until 12 noon, we would give away free cookies. We figured if we could get people there to taste the product, they would come back and buy it. So we show up on the 29th of June. We were there about 7 o'clock in the morning. We get ready to get the store together. We put our first batch of cookies in the oven, 300 cookies in this huge revolving oven. It's got a window on the front of it. People out in the mall can actually watch the cookies bake. We have the gate down so nobody's going to push their face up against it and get hurt. But they're excited. We're excited. They're watching these little dough balls. They're all hand scooped. They look like almost ice cream scoops sitting on the trays. And they're going round and round on this big Ferris wheel. And they start going from this ice cream scoop, creamy white to tan. And just at the moment when the bell went off, 15 minutes after we put those cookies in the oven, they had reached the most beautiful golden brown color you've ever seen. Cracking with steam coming out. People in the mall are out there. There's like 150 people out there. They're salivating, knowing that any moment now they're going to get these fantastic golden brown cookies. Now we're inside the store, and no one knows, of course, what's going on outside, but we decided with, again, no money, the only employees of the store were myself, my wife Donna, my partner Arthur, his wife Susan, their son Billy, my mother Lee, no paid employees, and we decided in this great symbolic gesture, we're about to start our business. We had a big oven handle on this big oven door. We'd all put our hand, like a baseball team might do as they're getting ready to go play. This is it, the beginning of our business. We all put our hand on that oven door and we open it up, and there, sitting on the trays at 350 degrees, are these magnificent golden brown chocolate chip cookies, and it was exactly at that moment we realized we had no pot holders. We didn't have any rags in the store. We had no napkins in the store. We had nothing. We had no way to get the cookies out of the oven. I promise every word of this is true. So now, of course, the people out in the mall have no idea what's going on. They're just watching the cookies go round and round. Did I mention they were golden brown? They go from golden brown to a much darker shade of brown to eventually catching on fire in the oven. Smoke was pouring out of our oven. We were on a combined air conditioning system with Park Lane Hosiery, which was right next door. People were running out of Park Lane Hosiery screaming. The fire department came. And I remember looking out beyond the gate and saw Jeff Weil, the mall manager, coming towards the store. And I was so thankful the gate was down. And he just asked one simple question. He said, "Is this what it's going to be like every day, guys?" And we tried to assure him once again with this great business plan. He barely bought it in his office. He certainly wasn't buying it that day. He could have broken our lease right there and held us responsible for that $250,000 worth of rent. But once again, he said, "Let's get this mess cleaned up. You guys open as quick as you can." So we stayed there all day, most of the night, cleaning up a big cookie mess. We had to go back out into the neighborhood, print up flyers that said, "Oops," and tell people again, tomorrow we're going to give away those free cookies from 9 to 12. We went around to the mall, gave it out to the mall employees as well. So we did open the next day. In our first 30 days of business, we needed to do $12,000 worth of business to break even. In fact, we did over $30,000 in those first 30 days. We went in that first month of business to being the highest revenue cookie company in the United States. No one ever caught us. We had stores that did well over $1 million a year from that moment on. We had people now applying for franchises, even though we weren't selling franchises yet. We had mall developers from all over the country offering us locations. Everything that you would think would be in place for the company to be a success seemed to be there. 6 weeks after we started the company, I was in a motorcycle accident. I woke up in Northside Hospital with 2 doctors standing over my bed telling me that I was going to live, but I'd been involved in this near-fatal motorcycle accident, and I would probably never walk normally again. I would always need some type of aid, either canes or crutches, but considering the alternative of not waking up at all, I thought that was okay. I began a rehabilitation program that the doctors had laid out for me. But 9 months after my accident, I had an incident with my daughter, Taryn, who was 3 years old at the time, that virtually changed my physical life and my business life forever. She asked me if I would race her to the mailbox. And I thought even on 2 canes, I could still beat her up to the mailbox. But when I took off to run, the pain was excruciating, and I couldn't do it. And she immediately saw that I couldn't do it, and she started making excuses like, "Well, Daddy, we don't have to run to the mailbox. I'm actually pretty tired today." And I was making excuses to her. It was a devastating moment, and it was the very first time since my accident that I realized that I was disabled. We managed to get to the mailbox, go back into the house, and I told my wife, Donna, I said, "There's no way I'm going to spend the rest of my life like this. Even if I don't get any better, I've got to take a different approach to this rehab." Because as I said, it was the first time since my accident that I realized that I was disabled. But not so much disabled in my legs, disabled in my mind. I grew up as a very poor kid and had to work 3 jobs all the way through junior high school and high school. And all through my life, people had always told me what my limits were and it gave me the incentive to prove them wrong. But this time, I was living in a safety zone that doctors had given me, and I can stand here today to tell you, when you're 33 years old, learning how to walk again really hurts. And so I began a self-styled rehabilitation program to get more strength and flexibility in my legs. And at the same time, we built the cookie company from that $8,000 investment to hundreds of stores nationwide and sales over $100 million. I not only learned to walk again, but set 3 world records riding across the United States on a bicycle. From Savannah, Georgia to San Diego, California in 1982, I crossed the country in a little over 15 days. In 1983, I set off one more time to break my own record. I was on a sub 9-day record, would have broken my record by over 6 days. I got hit by a dust devil, which is a dwarf tornado, got blown off my bike, broke my collarbone, ride was over. And much to my wife's chagrin, I came down the next morning after spending the night in the hospital and announced that I would do it one more time. And I did. So in 1984, I started out in Savannah again with 20 to 30 mile an hour headwinds, which got up to 70 miles an hour in California. Anybody in this room that rides a bike knows it's not heat, it's not rain, it's not cold that'll get you. Headwinds will kill you because they're just discouraging. And I faced them relentlessly during the entire ride from one end of the country to the other. I did manage to make it to the courthouse in San Diego, broke my record by over 4 days, crossed the country in 11 days, 8 hours, 15 minutes. And then in 1989, I joined a 4-man team to do the Race Across America, which went from Los Angeles to New York, about 3,000 miles. We won the Race Across America. We crossed the country in 5 days, 1 hour, 8 minutes. It's the fastest crossing of America by a 4-man team ever, and it's the fastest 3,000 miles ever covered by a 4-man team. And I'm proud to stand here today and tell you that both those records still stand. Thank you. Thank you. So, let me tell you that both of those stories are in my book. The first story about the cookie company and our first day, I love to tell that story because people who have been to one of our stores always assumed, as I said earlier, that things must have just gone smooth from the very beginning, because when you start a business with $8,000 and a $25,000 loan, you don't have much. You know, my kids, whenever I talk to kids about this, they'll always say, well, $8,000, that must have been a lot of money back then. And I always have to, $8,000 never been a lot of money to start a business. And the bottom line is, we had really studied the business. And to me, the story or the lesson that I want to share is this. We did all this research. We put everything we had on the line with both a bank and with a shopping mall developer. Everything we owned was on the line. We had signed it over. And we could have been put out of business by a $3 set of potholders. Now, here's the thing I want to share with you. If you're an entrepreneur, whatever it is you do, it is never about what you've planned for. It's always about dealing with the unexpected. And it's not about getting knocked down, it's about staying down. And you've got to continue to get up and keep going and know that you are going to run into things you never thought about. Things that will define whether you are a failure or a success in your business is how you deal with it. And the second thing I want to tell you in this story is this. When I talk about my 84 crossing and breaking my record by over 4 days, that in itself, I guess, could be a good story, but here's the real part of the story. Until I wrote the book, I never remembered what happened. We had police escorts from the time I left Savannah all the way till we got to the climb, last 4,000-foot climbs in California. The winds were so bad that we didn't know when or if I was going to make it to San Diego. And so we couldn't get a police escort. And of course, when did we arrive? Right in the middle of rush hour. It was the first time since I left Savannah that when my foot touched the ground along that ride or that race, that I didn't determine when it was going to happen. We had the police escorts when I had to get off the bike to either take a nap or maybe eat something or go to the bathroom, whatever it might have been. It was me who determined it. But I had only had 22 hours sleep in 11 days when we got to San Diego. And so when my crew decided that the only way that they could be sure that I could get there, because the crew couldn't go. We had a motorhome, we had 2 trucks, we had a press van, and they couldn't make it through the streets. And so they decided they would leave me on the freeway when we got off the freeway, and my friend Dave Johnson, who came from Atlanta, he would put the route out on his bike, and he would lead me the last 5 miles to the courthouse. And I was grateful to see him. Everybody left, and we are now going the last 5 miles to San Diego. I promise you, all I ever remembered was him meeting me and getting to the courthouse. I woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning after we wrote that chapter and said, Catherine, you're not going to believe what I remember. We've got to put it in the book. And here's what happened. We took off from that interstate exit, and we got to the first red light. I stopped, put my foot down, and something was bad. My legs started to cramp. But I was okay. Light turned green, we got back on the bike, rode a while, hit another red light. This one was a lot worse. With only 22 hours sleep, constantly pushing myself into headwinds, my body was just breaking down. And by about the third time we had to stop, about 3 miles now from the courthouse, I looked at Dave and said, I got nothing left. I'm done. And he looked at me as if I were speaking a foreign language. He said, we've only got a few miles to go. I said, I know, but it may as well be 1,000 miles. I just got nothing left. I got to go to sleep. If I could just get maybe 30 minutes sleep, I can finish. And he said, why don't you just try to ride to the next light? Just try to ride to the next light, which is like a block away. I said, okay. And the reason I was so scared is my legs were so cramped. I was afraid if I got on the bike and couldn't pedal, I'd fall over and really get hurt. But I got on the bike, I managed to get to a light, and then another light, and then finally we made the right turn on Broadway, which led us to the courthouse. People knew we were coming. The streets were lined with people applauding. The adrenaline kicked in. I got to the courthouse, broke the record, as I said, by over 4 days. And so the lesson for me, and when I talk about the fact that the experience I had with my daughter changed both my physical life and my business life forever, was this. One is that I knew if I could break my record, get across the country, I'd get my physical life back. But I had no idea the effect of those 5 miles were going to have on the rest of my life. What I realized, and it took me for the next course of my business career, was realizing that it doesn't matter how many thousands of miles you ride. It doesn't matter how many hours we put into a project. None of it matters. It's the last 5 miles that matter. It's how you finish. Even if you're in a project or putting out a new product that you know is not going to do everything you expected it to do, if you don't finish, you can't move on. Because the last 5 miles, at least for me, prepared me for the next 5 miles, which is what's led me through every other business I've been involved in ever since. So that is the second story I wanted to share with you. I want to leave time for some questions. The other thing I wanted to tell you about is that there's a big theme that runs through my book. It's the story of David and Goliath. And most people know that story. But I want to tell you why it has special meaning to me. So the story of David and Goliath is about this small man who steps into the valley with this enormous giant and not only wins the battle against the giant, even though the giant has armor and weapons, David, with only a slingshot and a few stones, manages to win that battle. And that story was the first story I ever remember about overcoming adversity. When I was 10, my family, we were probably, I would say, middle to upper middle class family. But when I was 10 years old, my father had a fire in his business and did no insurance and lost everything. And I mean, the only thing that was significant to me at the time was I had to give up my dog Lucky. I had to take Lucky up the street because we couldn't live in our house anymore. And we had to move to an apartment, and the apartment didn't allow dogs. But the truth is, at 10 years old, things didn't feel that different. Even though we were living in an apartment, we had to give up the house. We still had all of our furniture. We still had all of our plates. Everything seemed to be fairly normal. Meals were not quite as elaborate as they used to be. And I had to go do some odds and end jobs if I frankly wanted to buy some things for myself. My dad, who always thought he'd recover, continued to live a lifestyle that frankly we could not afford. And 3 years later, when his wages were being so garnished that he was barely bringing home anything from his paycheck, in the middle of the night, we left Buffalo, where I was living, and we moved to Florida, which is a debtor state, maybe still is, where you can't garnish anybody's wages. And my dad thought, we're going to go to Miami, I'll get a fresh start, and I can recover. Unfortunately for my dad, he never was able to recover. And in fact, when we got to Miami Beach, we moved into about a 300 square foot, one bedroom apartment. And if you can imagine this on Miami Beach with no air conditioning. And it was a big shock to me now at 13 in realizing our lives were never going to be what they were. And so I woke up, I remember that first morning in that apartment and thinking to myself, you can either accept what it is, or you can believe that your dad is going to recover and just try to wait it out. The truth is that I couldn't do that because my family and my dad was not even making enough money to afford that apartment. And so I started working. I started working several jobs. And I remember calling back on the story of David and Goliath, because remembering that story and my takeaway from the story is the thing that gave me the strength to continue to go on, find an incredible mentor who you'd read about in the book, a guy named Irving Settler, that took me into the clothing business where I worked for about 19 years. Because that story for me was never about David defeating the giant. For me, that story was always about the fact that David had the courage to step into the valley without knowing what the outcome is. And for all of us, each and every day, everyone faces their own Goliath challenges, whether it's learning to walk again, changing careers, starting a new business, losing weight, getting back, and whatever they are, whatever it is. Those are all Goliath-type challenges. And the real question we each have to ask ourselves is whether we have the courage to step into the valley. Thank you. I would love to answer some questions. Yes.
Thank you for your talk. 2 questions regarding headwinds. One, why not start in California and go the other way?
My nickname in the bicycle racing world was Wrong Way Coles. Well, I'll tell you honestly, because one, I expect to only do it once. The idea of riding across the country on a bike and winding up in Savannah just didn't appeal to me. It was more about standing on the Pacific Ocean if I was able to complete it. If I had to do it all over again, I probably would have been more enamored with Savannah and thought to myself, that's a great place to wind up. But in '89, of course, we did go from west to east. And it's just, if you read my book, and there are books outside, you realize that I've made a lot of silly mistakes in my life, but somehow it's worked out okay.
And the second question regarding headwinds, coffee and cookies, both crowded spaces. What kind of competitive advantage do you try to have before entering such a space?
Okay, I'm really glad you asked that. So the reason we succeeded in the cookie business when I told you there were 3 major companies. One had 100 stores. I think I mentioned that. One had 100 stores, 2 had 50 stores. They were gone by the time we had 100 stores. They were basically people that came out of the bakery business. We succeeded because we didn't know what the hell we were doing. I was basically a retailer. And so we trained our people the same way you would if you were going to run any retail business. Suggestive selling, lots of merchandise, lots of promotions. And during the course of running the cookie company, I developed a formula, which will tell you that a number of friends of mine who run all kinds of different businesses have adopted. And the formula is P, the letter P, plus E, plus the letter S, equals capital E, small f. And what that stands for is product, or people you could say, product plus environment plus service equals the experience factor. Now I'm in a room with a lot of very smart math people, but let's just look at algebra for a minute. I hadn't taken it in a long time, but what I try to tell our people by giving them such a simple formula, that if you change one thing in that equation, you will not get the same answer. So every customer that comes through the door, you got to give them all 3. You got to give them a great product, you got to give them a great environment, and you got to give them a great service. They won't come back. And the other thing that I was able to do when I ran the film office in Georgia, which at one time was the number 3 producer of motion pictures in the world. When I got there, we were 12. We had lost our place. And somewhere during the course of running the cookie company, I started asking questions backwards. Instead of trying to figure out at the cookie company how we could get more customers, I started asking the question, why does anyone ever come and buy a cookie? Because my belief was that you can't figure out how you're going to do more until you figure out what you're doing right now. And so in the film business, when I got there, I sat down with the executive director, and he was just whining about what had happened to the business. And he said, we just need to get more people here. And I said, well, you know, Greg, if we don't have tax incentives, we don't have a production facility, we don't have a place to edit, we don't have any of these things you're telling me we need, why does anyone ever come here? And he looked at me and I said, Greg, until we can figure that out, we can't figure out how to bring more people here. And that's exactly what we did. We figured out, why do people come to Georgia? And the reason was they love Georgia. They love the big airport. They love the fact we have this great airport in Georgia. They love the fact that the people are great and friendly and all of those other things. And the one thing we didn't really have was a good tax incentive bill. We got that, and we went from $170 million in economic impact in the movie business. When I left, it was $1.2 billion. It's now over $11 billion, and Georgia is the #1 producer of full feature films in the world. And so I think I answered your question. I mean, it's a question of, everybody talks about differentiating yourself, from your competition. In coffee, it was almost the same thing. Every time I would have a meeting with my people that I was trying to get encouraged over the fact that Starbucks at that time had about 7,500 stores. Today they're over 35,000. But back then, they would say to me, how can we compete against them? They have 7,000 stores. They're a public company. They've got all kinds of resources. Caribou is about 180 stores. And I got so disgusted in one meeting, I went up to the whiteboard, which I was not familiar with doing. I have a terrible handwriting. And I walked up to the whiteboard and I drew a line, and I put a square on one side of the line and a square on the other side of the line. And I asked them, you know what that is? Nobody knew. And I said, that's the road. And on the left side is Starbucks, and the right side is Caribou. Our job, that's the battlefield right there. We gotta convince them to make a right turn to come to us. And once they do it, we have to make the experience so exceptional, they'll continue to make that right turn. And it doesn't matter whether you're in the lawyer business, the cookie business, whatever business you're in. That's what it's really about, is winning that battle day to day. And we did that at Caribou. We were able to turn the company around from negative same-store sales to actually taking the company public in 2005.
So, Michael, why did you choose cookies? I mean,
Well, you don't
did
like
you have
cookies?
a love of
What are you, a
cookies?
communist?
Or, yeah, no, I mean, like, did anybody ever wonder that? I mean, you could have chose anything. You were going to start a business. Why cookies?
Okay, so I'll try to do this kind of quickly, but it was not my intention. One, I had been in the clothing business for 19 years. The business was changing. I had come to Atlanta because at one time it was the major production facility for clothing in the world was the South. Cheap labor, no unions, you know the drill. Everybody knows the drill. But even over a period of time, people found they could produce stuff overseas in Asia for less money. And so the industry started moving. I had 3 small kids. I was traveling about 3 days a week. And if I stayed in the business, I was going to probably have to start traveling 3 weeks a month. And so I went to California for what turned out to be my last clothing show. I saw a cookie store in a mall. Cookies were not great, but the line was very long. I learned a lot. There's a whole big story about it in the book, but I literally thought to myself, you know what? I'm going to get out of the clothing business, and I'm going to do something else that can let me stay close to home. And so I came back. I told Donna when I was going to get out of the business. I said, you know, I saw this cookie store in California, and while we're trying to figure out what to do next, let's open a cookie store. And the important part of the A cookie store is that my motorcycle accident virtually stopped me from doing anything else. I never had any intention in building a national chain of cookie stores. But when I had my accident, you know, remember, this is 1977, you couldn't really go out and interview for jobs on a walker. You know, it was a big no-no back then. And so I decided, well, you know, I better focus on this business until I can, you know, can walk again. And by the time I was walking and doing well, we had about 25 stores, and I stopped printing my business cards in pencil. And so I literally woke up one morning and said, you know what, maybe this is what I'm supposed to do, and so we focused on the business. So it was an accidental success, I guess you could say.
So, did I miss somebody's hand? Oh, over here.
So what is the criteria to justify a risk? How would you justify becoming homeless by putting your family's wealth and everything at risk versus starting a business? What's the criteria for the justification?
If I understand the question, you're asking like how to put everything at risk when you have your family and all of that?
Yeah, the criteria.
Yeah. So when I was 22 years old, I had won a big sales contest for the company I was with, and my company upgraded me to fly back first class. And so I was sitting next to a guy, and I was the closest I had ever been to a Rolex watch. And that guy would not have been on a commercial plane today, but fortunately for me, he was. And as we were landing, I looked at him and I said, what advice would you give a young guy like me that's about to go out into the business world? And without hesitation, he looked at me and he said, take risks as early as you possibly can in your life, because the longer you wait, the more complicated your life's going to get, and it's just going to get harder and harder. And I've always heeded that advice. Now, I will admit that when we started the cookie company, I could not have done it in a more risky time. You know, we had 3 kids, a mortgage, and everything else, and we put everything up in line. But honestly, I think from where I came, having the support of my family and knowing whatever the outcome was, knowing I would be okay, as long as I still had that, I was willing to take the risk, and it worked out fine.
Great insight. I really appreciate that. So you mentioned going into the arena to face the unknown. Do you have any particular habits or rituals that may help young entrepreneurs like us kind of do that fearlessly?
Yeah, I guess I would say try to know as much about what you're doing as you possibly can so that you can walk into the arena with a lot of confidence. Whether it, again, whatever obstacles come up, be prepared to deal with them. And that doesn't mean you're always going to do them all right, but just, you know, there's an old saying, you know, if you make the majority of your decisions that are right, that's all you really can expect. The other piece of advice I would say is this. It took me a long time to learn this because I started working when I was so young. I thought by the time I was 30, I knew all the answers. I realized by the time I was 30, I was right. I didn't know all the answers. My problem was I didn't know all the questions. And so the advice I would give you is that the biggest learning experience I had was knowing I didn't have to know all the answers, that I didn't have to be the guy that knew everything, that I could surround myself with people that were smarter than me in other areas of the business. We could learn from each other. I think if you step into the arena with that kind of help behind you, it's pretty hard to fail.
Hey, I used to live in Atlanta, so I've been to the Perimeter Mall, and my first cookie was at the Gwinnett Place Mall, right up the way, so to let you know that.
And I want to thank you from the bottom of my wallet.
The birthday cookie was great. My question is, Barrett Patel, local hotel owner, you ran for political office. Any lessons from the political world to the business world, political world that you'd like to share with us?
Say that again?
You ran for public office.
I did.
Is there any lessons from the political world that you know can help you in the business world and vice versa, in the business world that you learned in the political world while you were running for office?
The question, what did I learn from those? Oh, well, let me just say this. I'm sorry? Yeah, so one, there's not a lot that translates. You would think there would be, but there's not. Politics is tough, and especially if you're running against an incumbent, you know, but you think about this in America, I got to run against the Speaker of the House, and in most countries, you know, if you were going to try to take down the Speaker of the House, you'd have to do it with, like, you know, guns and tanks, and we did think about it. We did. But this country's great. I mean, it's the only country in the world where you can be a kid like me and step into the arena and try to get elected and try to do the right thing. Unfortunately, it didn't work out. But the one thing that did work out is that there were things I went into running for office, especially in the U.S. Senate race, that I cared about. And there were other things that I learned along the way that wound up becoming as important or more important. One of them was traveling around the state of Georgia and realizing how mistreated our veterans have been. And it's a disgrace to what's happened to veterans in this country. And my wife and I have done everything we can as private citizens now to try to support and help veterans get back on their feet, because it doesn't look like the government's ever going to do it. So, but that's one of the things that happens when you run for office, is that when the election is over, it's not like you wake up the next day and say, let's put that on sale. You know, let's try another way to approach this. When the election's over, it's over. I remember after '96, when I lost to Newt Gingrich, I remember calling my campaign manager up and saying, all right, so what do we do now? And she said, what do you mean, what do we do now? I said, well, what do we do? You know, I got all these things I care about. She said, we pack up the office, I go back to Washington, and you go back to the cookie company. And I was flabbergasted by the fact that it never even dawned on me that there was nothing else you could do. Well, by the time I ran in '98, I knew pretty much what would happen. And that's why all the stars had aligned in '98 when I had the opportunity to sell the company, and that's why I sold it. But I found myself after that election learning two valuable lessons, because all the polling showed that I was going to win. One, I learned can't trust the polls, and you can't trust the stars either for aligning. So I wound up, you know, at the end of it, that was it. So.
Hi, Michael. Dr. Richard Benassi. I'm one of the directors at the Tampa Bay Wave. During your time in Atlanta, you've seen some significant change. The city's really embraced two things, film and television, and then also technology. And my question is really around what were the critical drivers that the city implemented, or what did the civic leaders do to further push technology as, you know, Atlanta being like tip of the spear for the city itself, and how can we replicate that here in Tampa?
Well, you know, I would say this. I mean, Atlanta has an incredible history of, well, you know, the old expression was in '96 when we had the Olympics. It's the city too busy to hate. And if you could look at the history of Atlanta and its progressive attitude towards business and education and all, you know, we have 45 universities and colleges in the state of Georgia, which is just unheard of for a state that size. But we have had governors in Georgia that have been all about building business. And back in the day, I remember back in, even in 98, 99, when Governor Barnes was there, he recognized that if the state was going to stay where it was, which was at that time, it was like the state to do business in, that we had to look outside the agricultural industry and some of the other industries that we had, and that there was an incredible amount of technology companies that were trying to get started in Georgia, and so they created some great incentive programs for incubators and for people who were going to, create places for companies to start. There were, more tax incentives. I can't tell you what it would take to do it in Tampa, because I certainly had, I did the movie thing, but I don't know about the rest of it. But I would just say this, is that if Tampa is not recognizing the importance of technology and the fact that it's a clean industry, high-paying industry, and find a way to embrace more of it, they're gonna miss out on what the real future is for the area. So.
Michael, entrepreneurs never retire. So what's the next chapter for Michael?
Honestly, I don't know. I'm very happy right now about what my book has done. And again, I just want to share the story with as many people as I possibly can, because I really feel like, and I've gotten tremendous feedback on the book. It's gotten very good reviews. It's taken off in a way that has been somewhat unexpected. But I figure, some opportunity will come along. I think at least have one more in me. I'd like to do something else. But if it doesn't happen, it doesn't happen. I'll come around, come talk to groups and try to encourage them to do more than they think they can. And that wouldn't be so bad. And we have a home in Jackson Hole, and I do a lot of fly fishing. That's not so bad either. So.
Hi, I'm Valerie. I'm a retired Army First Sergeant, and I wanted to know how many veterans are in the room? All right. Well, thank you all for your service, and I really just have a comment. Thank you for being an advocate for veterans. You and your wife, it is who I am, it is what I am, and being a veteran advocate for our community, we really appreciate that.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for your service. Anyone else? Oh. By the way, I have nowhere to go. I got a free hotel room. I mean, I'm good.
3 quick questions. What's your favorite cookie? What's your favorite Indian dish? And out of the stories that you shared with us today, what was the hardest journey?
My favorite cookie is white chocolate mac, which is very, very good cookie. What was the second question? I got the third one. Oh, my favorite. I don't know what any of them are called, honestly. I mean, but I really love Indian food. But I tell you, I was so spoiled in '98 because almost every event I went to, they were done in halls, and the food was being brought in from people who made them in their home. And so I thought, I'd go to any Indian restaurant, it would taste the same. Not the case. Not the case. So yeah, I like all of it. I like it spicy, and yeah, it's great. And I would say that, probably on the list of things hardest to do, there's probably 3. One was giving away my dog when I was 10. I remember it like it was yesterday, putting her in a little red wagon with her food and food dish. I honestly, it was like an out-of-body experience. I would say the second thing would probably have been learning to walk, learning to do that and not knowing what the outcome would be. And then I guess recently, I just finished being 6 years clean from cancer. And so that was also not easy.
So, Michael, on my notes I put, it's not what happens to you, it's what happens in you, and how you finish determines how you're going to start, from what you've shared with us. However, if you could only leave one sentence for everybody in the room, what would you leave us with today?
Here's what it would be. Always remember, the deepest feeling of failure comes from self-imposed limits, period.
Let's have a
Thank
big
you
round
all.
of applause.